Jesse, are we ready to begin?
Yes, go ahead.
Welcome everyone to the National Creating Coherence webinar series. My name is Sam Katz, and our guest today is Dr. John Hagelin, who is joining us from the lovely campus of Maharishi International University in Fairfield, Iowa. Dr. Hagelin is a world-renowned quantum physicist, author, educator, public policy expert, and leading proponent of peace. He has conducted pioneering research at CERN, the European Center for Particle Physics, and at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Dr. Hagelin is the recipient of the prestigious Kilby Award and responsible for the development of a highly successful grand unified field theory based on the superstring that was featured in a cover story of Discover magazine. Dr. Hagelin is the president of Maharishi International University and the national director of Maharishi Foundation, responsible for teaching the Transcendental Meditation Program through 180 teaching centers in the United States. The title of his talk today is Higher States, Bursting the Bounds of Waking Consciousness. Dr. Hagelin will be exploring how the discovery of higher states of consciousness and their universal accessibility through the Transcendental Meditation and TM City program, rooted in ancient Vedic literature, radically changes our understanding of consciousness and the limits of human potential, with far-reaching implications for the individual and society. If you would like to ask Dr. Hagelin a question, he'll be taking some questions after his talk. And if you'd like to ask him a question, please email your questions to questions, that's questions plural, questions@tm.org. Questions@tm.org, or you can just type it into the Zoom chat box. Welcome, Dr. Hagelin. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that kind introduction. Thank you for all those who have come, our intrepid masked marauders who are here in Dalby Hall at Maharishi International University for coming in person. And especially thank all of you who have connected to these weekend broadcasts, and particularly who have lent your coherence and your deep consciousness to the country to provide stability in unstable times. In this talk, we're going to be trying to understand, and I think understanding, higher states of consciousness and how to achieve them. And I'm going to move a little quickly in the beginning through some perhaps by now familiar concepts as what we understand higher states of consciousness to be. What is consciousness itself, after all, which is at the foundation of all the states of consciousness, even waking, dreaming, and sleeping. And as you know, there's been a great deal of press, actually, continuously in recent years. There have been literally explosive discoveries in astronomy, the amazing world of relativistic astrophysics and cosmology, which have shown us, particularly cosmology, the just unfathomable expanse and unbelievable intelligence expressed throughout this enormous, ever-expanding universe whose size appears to be infinite, or at least so close to infinite that it hardly makes a difference. The mystery remains, how did this universe emerge? Where did it come from? It's a rather mysterious thing. Here it is, we're in it, but the origins of the universe, of course, have captured the imagination of philosophers and cosmologists and spiritual experts and so forth for so many centuries. And we have new light on that subject from modern physics and also from the ancient Vedic science of consciousness, including yoga and so forth. The key to understanding outer space is to understand inner space, to look more deeply into the essence of who we are and the essence of what the universe is and what it is made of. And those greatest discoveries, those foundational discoveries into the core nature of matter and the core nature of reality have come from looking within, which in the language of physics means taking our attention for a moment away from the unbelievable spectacle of our ever-expanding universe to smaller and smaller scales, more fundamental space-time scales, starting from where we start, which is the sensory world, for which we have good laws of nature put forward by Sir Isaac Newton hundreds of years ago, so-called brick and mortar physics, macroscopic physics, the physics of this delicious beverage, for example. But underneath that surface physics is the world of the atom and the world of molecules. And that world of atoms and molecules has its own reality, its own laws of nature, its own language, its own logic. And underlying even quantum mechanics is a deeper realm of quantum reality called quantum field theory, governed by a new theory, quantum field theory, with its own logic and its own set of laws and its own language and its own mathematics. And that has basically taken us to the threshold of infinity, in the threshold of absolute unity. And those theories of unity are relatively recent to emerge, mostly within the last 2 decades, and the most successful in the context of what is called string theory and M theory. String theory, as it is developed and confirmed ultimately, is the fulfillment of Einstein's lifelong quest to discover the unified source of this incredibly diversified universe, to understand the origin of the laws of nature, the fountainhead of all the fundamental particles and forces of nature. And string theory describes that by firstly identifying this unified field, this ocean of pure existence, this ocean of eternal, unchanging silence, pure being at the basis of this turbulent universe. And like an ocean is silent at its depth, similarly, the unified field is silence. It's eternal at its depth. It was there before the Big Bang emerged and will be there when this universe ceases to be. But on the surface of that ocean of pure existence, pure being, is this roiling and boiling upheaval of activity, like leading to an effervescence of bubbles, much like ginger ale effervesces bubbles. Not surprisingly, these bubbles or superstrings aren't ginger ale, but they are tiny elastic loops, literally like rubber bands, only different. Rubber bands are made of rubber, and they have some thickness to them. Superstrings are made of really consciousness, and they are really more of a conceptual reality. Real, but they live more on a conceptual level. The strings have no dimension, and yet they are elastic. And that explains, indirectly, the emergence of us, the emergence of this beverage, the emergence of atoms and molecules. Because rubber bands, superstrings, can vibrate. And they can vibrate in different ways. They're so-called clockwise vibrations of strings. Yes, you can do that experiment at home with a rubber band and see that indeed it can move clockwise. It can move in a variety of different ways. It's the clockwise vibrational states of superstrings that mimic gravity, that actually are gravity. They give rise, those little vibrating strings we think of appear to act like gravitons, particles of gravity. Similarly, the other forces of nature, electromagnetism and the weak force and the nuclear force, they come from counterclockwise vibrational states of these tiny, tiny superstrings. And again, those are the 4 forces that really, especially electromagnetism, that governs almost everything in our environment that we see, that we experience, except for gravity. And then finally, all of the more so-called material particles like electrons and quarks and protons and neutrons and the Higgs boson and neutrinos, those are simply a consequence of different types of vibrations of these superstrings that are neither simply clockwise nor clockwise. So this superstrength theory, in its own language, in its own way, very precise way, very successful way, explains the mystery of the emergence of the fundamental particles and forces of nature, which somehow in the past magically come out of the unified field. And that magic basically has been illuminated by string theory, which says that what really comes out of the unified field are these percolating superstrings, these vibrating loops, and those vibrating loops, through their various qualities, their various energies, their various masses, actually correspond to all the particles and forces that we know and love, all coming from the clockwise and counterclockwise and other vibrational states of these superstrings. And that, in a nutshell, is the unified field theory. And it's a remarkable success of the scientific method. In a sense, what we're talking today when it comes to consciousness and enlightenment is really this same mechanics put into a different language, a more relevant language to living conscious beings, a more intuitive language, I think, for most of us. So we're going to switch gears from physics, given that background, to talking now about consciousness, something very close to home. Consciousness, there's nothing closer to home than consciousness. Our consciousness is what we are. It's who we are. It's the experiencer in us. It's the I within each of us. That is consciousness. And if we want to look at consciousness or look at mind, we can see, based on, well, modern psychology and frankly more profoundly, the Vedic psychology, particularly in what is called yoga, from where transcendental meditation comes and where the yoga asanas and pranayama come. It's a highly developed science of mind, and it divides the human mind into these four basic categories. The most superficial level of our minds, most superficial level of our consciousness is articulated thought, spoken thought. When is this over? What's for lunch? That kind of dialogue is, sure, bubbling up in our minds right now. And our mind is bubbling with these, these questions, these thoughts, incessantly throughout the day. But subtler than just surface chatter are more abstract and powerful thoughts, conceptual thoughts, the thoughts that allow us to formulate language and concepts like dog, which stands for many different things, but we have this concept of dog. It allows us to very easily communicate, even write poetry. So this is the level of abstract thinking. It's the realm of the absent-minded professor, but we all have that capability to think abstractly, or we couldn't formulate language and speak in language. We go back. Subtler than that is fine feeling. Our fine feeling level, which is more abstract even than abstract thought, but very intimate to us, very important to us, how we're feeling good, feeling bad. And beyond the subtlest feeling is, just as we know on this call, pure being, something that is so abstract that most people don't even know about, don't even recognize necessarily that it even exists. But if our core consciousness didn't exist, there would be no feeling, there'd be no mind, there'd be no speech, there'd be no I, there'd be no experiencer. So Atma, the self, subtle, but very important. Nothing would exist, and we certainly wouldn't exist without that. Now for fun, I'll take a 60-second foray, because I can't resist, as a mathematical physicist. Note that mathematicians of the last 2 centuries have taken these levels of mind, these levels of expanded comprehension, from the concrete thoughts to the most expansive thoughts and feelings and pure being, and put them into mathematical language. They've created a language relevant to each of these different levels of the human mind, different levels of concreteness versus expansion of the mind. The most concrete, the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3. A little more expansive, the whole numbers, in which this abstract concept of zero is now incorporated. More expanded than that are the integers, which include the negative numbers as well. A bigger set than that, you could say at least more complete than that, is when you include the fractions between the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And once you've mastered that, the rational numbers, you can do accounting, for example, for a living. Not necessarily at the highest levels of accounting theory, but at least you can balance the books. Beyond these so-called rational numbers or fractions are the real numbers. where there are no gaps between any numbers, but you have a complete smooth continuum called the continuum or continuous number line. You need those to do physics. You can't do even classical physics without understanding the continuum. It's a very huge range of numbers compared to the previous ones I've mentioned. It's a much larger infinity than the previous infinite sets I've discussed. To do quantum physics, you need to go beyond real numbers to what are called complex numbers, which I won't attempt to describe today. To do quantum field theory, you have to go on and consider what are called function spaces. But in any case, as you study nature at the deeper and deeper levels, you need more expansive, more powerful, and yes, more abstract concepts to handle nature and to describe nature properly. And there is a limit to all of this. There's a limit to what we call conceivable mathematics and conceivable infinity. And that really spells the limit of what we call the human intellect. That is kind of the limits of what we call rational thought. But the mathematicians, smart as they are, can prove there's something beyond the largest conceivable infinity. There's something we could call infinity beyond comprehension by the mind, or the infinity of sets, or unity of sets, universe of sets in the language of mathematics. So something exists beyond the mind, and that's familiar to us as being. That's familiar to us meditators as the Atma, the infinite self. So these different levels of expanded human mind in the different expansive languages of mathematics correspond to more expansive levels of human awareness, more comprehensive levels of the human mind. But the amazing thing to many physicists who marvel over this fact is that these different languages of math and the different levels of our human minds, they actually correspond step by step to the structure of physical nature. The surface level of nature of material particles, the subtler levels of quantum mechanics and wave functions, the subtler levels of quantum field theory, unified field theory, they all, in order to explain or comprehend or work on those theories, you need to access deeper levels of the mind and utilize more expansive levels of mathematics, which has led many to believe, and Maharshi certainly, myself, but many, many others, to conclude that because the structure of the human mind, from absolute to relative, from infinity to a point, and the structure of physical nature as we've studied it, from the unified field to the tiniest grain of sand, those two structures of mind and the structure of matter fit each other like a glove. And that is why many have been drawn to conclude that the origin of mind, which is consciousness, and the origin of matter, which is the unified field, are one and the same. And that the experience of pure consciousness, the meditative state, is really just the subjective experience of that universal intelligence, that same unified field that physics identifies at the origin of the universe. That's consciousness. What is meditation? This we know. This I barely need discuss. We can take the mind from our engrossment in surface thoughts, where we spend most of our daily lives, and we can turn the attention within, and through a technique that is natural and effective, we can draw the mind automatically and innocently within on this sweet and gentle journey to quieter and quieter, more blissful levels of thinking, slipping beyond the finest feeling, the vaguest sense of mantra, to experience purely consciousness, pure consciousness, or samadhi in the language of yoga. And it's an amazing thing. I'll just quote the first verse of the Yoga Sutras, literature of yoga. Yoga, transcendental consciousness, unbounded awareness, is simply the complete settling of the activity of the mind. Well, that should be easy, because the running mind could always slow down. Anyone who can run can walk, and anyone who can walk can stand still. Yes, we have the ability for the mind can stand still. And when that wave of thought settles, when the wave settles down and stands still, meaning when the wave settles down and merges with the ocean, that's it. That localized wave is now the infinite ocean. And just as simply, you would think that our active mind splashing around on the surface of the ocean, constantly bouncing off walls and engaging in one thought after another, driven by unfulfilled aspirations, unfulfilled desires, by the karmas and by vata and by rajas and by whatever drives us constantly. If the mind could just slow down, and in principle it can, occasionally it will on its own, it's not as easy because of all of those activities and karmas and tendencies and habits that drive us constantly. That's why a technique has been brought back to the world from the ancient Vedic wisdom and science of yoga by Maharishi to basically lure the mind to the state of silence with a strong draw of increasing bliss and satisfaction along the way, so that the mind will, at least momentarily, slip past the buffeting of surface stimulation and go and experience its own nature. And that is called transcending. That is the meditative state that is described in the literature of yoga, the Upanishads, as the peaceful, the blissful, the undivided or unified, is thought to be the fourth state of consciousness. That is the self. That is to be known. Now, we know in this scientific age, we talk about this as a hypometabolic physiological state. We honor the original our founding president, Dr. Keith Wallace's research in this area to identify pure consciousness as a fourth state of consciousness, and a state with enormous practical benefits, as we all know, and recognition by scientific research institutions throughout the country, throughout the world, and with profound effects, for example, in reducing heart disease by more than half, and all stress-related illness, and so much more in terms of development of physiology, development of mind. And that I don't need to review for this group. More important, or most important, or certainly to me as an educator, and I think as a human being, the most really phenomenally important of this transcending is its effect on the mind and ultimately on our level of consciousness. The meditative state is a state of profoundly integrated brain functioning. And this orderliness or coherence in brain functioning relates to intelligence and creativity and executive functioning, academic performance, creativity, and so forth. And real measures of intelligence in college students and others who practice TM regularly show highly significant improvements in all the categories of intelligence that are used in the industry of education and psychology. The most intriguing for a moment that I want to dwell on is a very important one called field independence. Field independence is our ability to focus sharply on the highly specific content of our challenge, of our problem, of our task, while maintaining to an extraordinary degree an awareness of the wholeness in which that problem, in which those specifics are embedded. And that awareness of the wholeness guides our specific mental processing and functioning and work to the greater goal. Keeps everything in context with the whole. And that's the only way you can solve complex problems. The localized mind can't focus on all those components that'll inevitably have to be taken into account to come up with an effective solution, an optimal solution. But that broadened mind can juggle all those and comprehend them in that broad scope while nailing down the specifics of the solution. But I just wanted to share this because not everybody is aware of it, I think. When the awareness expands and the brain functions in an integrated way, in a highly coherent way, that means the whole brain is engaged. The whole brain is coordinated and engaged in all the specific tasks that a brain could perform. And you see striking evidence of this in recent government research on peripheral vision. And just to be slightly familiar with the structure of our eye, you know, at the back of the eye, we have the retina, which is composed of many, many different optical cells. Some are designed to see very faint light in black and white. Those are the rods, so-called, and the cones are designed to see color. And they are focused more in the center of the eye, which is where we have our clearest daytime vision. So normally, the eye has this concentration of rods and cones in the more or less center of the back of the eye, where our vision is clearest. And outside of that, it gets vaguer and fainter, more blurry. But this is government research, military research, that were concerned about a soldier's ability to land via parachute in the middle of a battlefield, with soldiers raging on both sides of the conflict, scattered here and there, and the ability of the soldier to figure out very, very quickly what is going on so that they can run to the correct side and avoid harm. And that requires the ability to see broadly and to comprehend broadly and quickly. So they were doing research on TM and peripheral vision as a measure of a soldier's ability to actually take in the broad picture and not get lost in the trees, see the forest, not just the trees. And what they found with the meditators who'd been practicing regularly for a year and then 2 years is, if you look at this, a spreading out across the eye, the broader eye, more and more encompassing the whole eye, of a higher density of rods and cones, meaning, for some reason, meditators were developing wide-angle vision, peripheral vision. And that was a very significant result. And Carol Bandy, Dr. Carol Bandy at the Norwich University was a key part of this study, principal investigator in this study. But that's remarkable. It shows a couple of things. It shows that the eye is capable of laying down more light cells anytime it wants. The eye could presumably lay down more rods and cones, and every time you have more rods and cones, you're actually increasing the bandwidth of what's called the optical nerve, which carries all that information to the brain. You're adding strands to the optical nerve, carrying each impulse from every single light cell in the eye. And if we could all do that, think of the survival advantage of people who had razor-sharp peripheral vision and could look out in front of a whole class and tell at a glance who hadn't brushed their teeth, but see exactly, who is there without having to, move your head around. Why don't we all do that? Why doesn't everybody, if we can, why doesn't for our, survival, why haven't we evolved to the point where we have that broad vision capability? And the reason is the bandwidth of our consciousness and the parallel processing capability of our brains is limited in waking consciousness because there's no global coherence. There's no global processing taking place, just isolated activities throughout the brain, uncoordinated with each other. But when the brain becomes wired together and can function as a whole, the parallel processing capability that brings would allow us to take in more information. The bandwidth of the human eye for absorbing information is about a megabit per second, about roughly what a high-definition television signal can produce. And that's kind of it. You don't need more information than that. You can't see more information than that, really. But if you increase the bandwidth of the human brain, then you could, and in fact, we do see more information being delivered because more information can be used. So I just dropped that, but it's an interesting point that when we talk about development of consciousness, we're talking about the transformation of our physiology. And not just the brain, but really everything that the brain works with can now be enhanced in its functioning. The rest of my talk is really going to be focused on pure consciousness, samadhi. Pure consciousness is sometimes called the absolute. Absolute means without the boundaries of specific qualities. It's not sweet, it's not salty. It's not light, it's not heavy. It is beyond attribute. It is beyond change. It is beyond time, beyond space. So we call that the absolute. As compared to what? As compared to everything else. As compared to what we call the relative, or the world, the ever-changing relative. Outside this timeless ocean, the source of the universe, from there comes the universe, and everything in the universe is always evolving. It's always changing. There's nothing in the universe that is static. So that's the relative. Compared to the never-changing, absolute, there is the ever-changing relative. Compared to the unity of being, there is the diversity of the outer world and the diversity of outer experience. So yes, we have the inner absolute and the outer relative. Inner absolute, the outer relative. But there's something missing from this picture when you think about it. There must be some transition between absolute and relative. Because how could the eternal, never-changing give rise to the ever-changing, give birth to the ever-changing, without some transition between the never-changing and the ever-changing? It's not a sharp line like that. It may seem that in the early days of meditation. It may even seem that in cosmic consciousness, perhaps. But really, there's a process of emergence, and that process of emergence of relativity begins within the absolute. And we're going to take, for a little while now, a close-up look at the structure of the absolute and the mechanics of its generation, its creation, of the relative world of thought and action and relative matter, ultimately. So let's blow up this thing. Let's take a look at the absolute. And the absolute, you could see, is a world of unity, but a unity of a different, of an evolving type. At the very foundation, we have something we could call infinite silence. Absolute abstraction. Unfathomable silence. Adyanta on the right is a Sanskrit term from the Yoga Sutras, which means total annihilation of what? Of anything relative. Absolute silence, infinite silence, absolute abstraction. But from that abstract state of just pure transcending in the extreme, the very core of transcendent being, we see, because, and purely because, the absolute is consciousness. We see, because it is consciousness, it's the ability of the absolute to begin more and more to experience and reflect upon and enjoy its own nature as consciousness. That experience is not typically the first experience of transcending. First experience of transcending for a new meditator is typically a gap, a brief, indefinable, fleeting period in which you don't think you were asleep, but you can't remember anything specific until the thought comes. You look at the thought comes, and what was that? Oh, that might be transcending. Maybe that's transcending. Next time I'll see for sure. But transcending by nature is so abstract that it takes quite some time to, I would say, be palpably used to and familiar with that state of absolute silence. But because it's consciousness, that silence, being consciousness, in a little bit more lively state, is experienced not as nothing, not as absolute abstraction, not as a gap, but is experienced as abstract awareness. Awareness is not nothing. It's something very, very subtle, but it's not nothing. There's some light of awareness present. Let's call that pure abstract awareness. But a little more lively experience of the transcendent is that abstract awareness becomes a little bit more, you could call it self-awareness. There's no dialogue going on, nothing like that, but now there's an awareness of being. Not just abstract awareness, but an awareness of one's own being. And more lively experience than that, more developed, more differentiated experience of that, we could call a state of not just self-awareness or amness, but self-noticing. Noticing is a more lively state of the same thing. Oh, I am aware of myself. I'm noticing myself. Consciousness is noticing consciousness. Consciousness is experiencing consciousness through the process of experiencing. There's the knower and there's the known, both consciousness. Consciousness is knower, consciousness is known, and consciousness as the gap, the process of knowing that links the knower to the known. So they're there still in the transcendent, and a lively experience of the transcendent where I am experiencing myself. Now, this is still pure consciousness. It's still, we call it absolute, we call it pure consciousness because it is still consciousness, now consciousness knowing itself. So anyway, all of this has one thing in common. Well, it's all consciousness in its different stages of silence versus dynamic, and it is all unified. In other words, absolute abstraction is, if anything, one. Pure abstract awareness is just the unity of awareness, one. Self-awareness, a sense of self-awareness is still a unified experience. And even this self-knowing stage of we can call it I amness, maybe, where the knower, knowing, and known. Consciousness is the knower, consciousness is the known, it's the process of knowing. It's all still consciousness, and it is experienced as such. So this is all pure consciousness, but in different stages of awakening of what you could call the intellect, the seed of the intellect. And the intellect is our most fundamental organ besides the absolute. It is the foundation of what we call mind. And the nature of the intellect is to discern or to discriminate A from B. It draws distinctions. That's what a discriminative person is. They can distinguish A from B. That's what the intellect is, that it's its purpose, that's its nature. So here we have the intellect is awakening, where consciousness is now being discriminated by the mind as consciousness is knower, consciousness is known, consciousness is process of knowing. But they're all seen as one. The intellect is able to see the distinction, but knows the union. Another thing we could say about this structure of pure consciousness and its various levels of silence versus dynamism, the infinite silence of this absolute abstraction becomes, at the level of pure awareness, it gains a hint of dynamism. It gains the light of consciousness. And if you want to take the Vedic literature, sometimes that infinite silence is called Shiva. Sometimes dynamism, awakening within that silence is called Vishnu, and so forth. The whole Vedic literature is basically, if you look at it carefully, as Dr. Tony Nader, for example, would, as certainly as Maharishi did, it is basically a language of consciousness. It is all about the fundamental dynamics of consciousness and the universe that emerges from consciousness. There's one more thing, one more way of drawing this, and Maharishi drew this for us. We didn't have video, but he was sketching it and describing it during the beginning days of our Invincible America Assembly here at MIU. There were 1,000 or 2 people in the domes, 1,000 perhaps in the domes. all committed every day. It's a long, deep program, just as today. But for the first year or so of that was really inspired by Maharishi, he would go with us deeply into the experience of pure consciousness. And he described pure consciousness experience, the meditative experience, the transcendental experience, as a cone of silence. And I do not mean this cone of silence. I mean this cone of silence. Now, Maharishi described transcendental experience as fathoming deeper and deeper levels of transcendental reality, fathoming deeper and deeper levels of the transcendent. And at the very foundation of it all, as we drew before, is absolute abstraction, adyanta bhav, the singularity of consciousness, infinite silence, Shiva, etc. And then a little bit more concrete and recognizable than that state of absolute abstraction, which is infinitely abstract and unfathomable, can only be fathomed by itself. It is beyond the realm of what we call ordinary experience. It's beyond the realm of what we call mind or intellect. Because it's beyond mind, it can't be articulated. It can only basically come to know itself by itself on its own level. But coming out of that, there's this, again, you can put these in a sequence of emergence: faint light of consciousness, hint of dynamism, pure abstract awareness, emphasis on awareness. A little bit more concrete, you could say self-referral. Self-referral means you've got the consciousness referring to consciousness, but that's a little more active because you've got consciousness referring to itself, but still very much unified. Another word for the same thing, the sanghita, togetherness of Rishi, Devata, and Chandas, togetherness of knower, knowing, and known. Maharishi all called that state of intimate, collection or cohesion of knower, knowing, and known is pure knowledge. And then more active than that is this self-knowing, self-interacting, anyonya bhav, which means absolute in transformation, etc. So different levels from surface to profound. And this level, again, at the bottom, is the light of consciousness is essentially transcendent at that point. No real sense of the light of consciousness, no sense of awareness on that level. It transcends even that to be pure silence. You could say Shiva. And that Maharishi described is what we were looking for. He wanted us to fathom, before he would talk about anything else, and this took half a year, before he would talk about other experiences of meditation and more enlivened states of pure consciousness and anything else, he wanted us all to fathom the depth of silence. And it's described also by Maharishi, quoting the Vedic literature, that tip of the needle is, he says, it's the end of what we could commonly call experience. It is the end of what we could commonly think of as experience. It is beyond mind, beyond language, beyond articulation, beyond the intellect. And he says, the literature says, from where speech returns. Meaning speech can't penetrate that level of experience. It turns around and goes home. It's just not welcome down there. It's ineffective there. It can't grasp that reality. But that grasping that reality, Maharishi felt, was very important, and for reasons I will now explain. And by the way, that infinite silence, in the Vedic literature, again, there are stories that Brahma, the creator, the creative impulse, the active mind, the intellect, which gives birth to mind and language and thought, represented by Brahma, the creator, meaning the impulse, the mechanics of creation, the impulse to create from, out of the eternal being, eternal silence. Shiva challenged Brahma asked if he could fathom Shiva's domain. And the rather, I would say, proud and competitive Brahma launched off on a flight around this vast, vast creation, trying to circumambulate, actually, Shiva's domain. And he came back exhausted and humbled that I cannot reach the domain of your existence, of your being. That's the intellect relative to pure being. Anyway, so described as the absolute in this diagram from its anchor in infinite, pure, unbounded, and unfathomable silence, which is the core of who we are. And that'll be experienced much more concretely as consciousness grows, and in these next slides, in fact. But from there to this state of unity in which knower, knowing, and known, in which Rishi, Devata, and Chandas are distinct, but perceived in their reality as ultimately unified, as shades of consciousness. That, we say, is absolute, transcendental. Outside of that, we have what is waking consciousness, unless we're dreaming or sleeping. In a waking consciousness, we still have a knower, the observer, we still have the observed, and we still have the process of observation. But in waking consciousness, something is lost. The perception, we lose the perception, we lose the comprehension that what we're seeing is also the self. That according to physics, everything that exists, the knower, the known, and process of knowing, are all one. They are all waves on the surface of the unified field. They're all expressions of the unified field. It's all one ocean of unity in motion. But in waking consciousness, we have the knower, and we have the known, and we have the process of knowing. But in waking consciousness, the known, the object, is not understood or experienced as being indistinguished from, unified with the subject. So as this chart shows, in relative experience, in waking consciousness, the known is not recognized as for what it is, as our own consciousness. And that inability to recognize what we see as inseparable from and identical to who we are, giving rise to this impression of a diversified universe, giving rise to the whole world, or I would say the whole mirage, the whole dream of diversity. That is sometimes called the mistake of the intellect. To mistakenly believe this based on many things, conditioning, there are many reasons for it, but it is a mistake ultimately, and unified field theory of physics confirms it. Of course, Vedanta confirms it. Experience of pure consciousness confirms it. So pragyaparad means mistake of the intellect. And that is where the absolute starts, so the absolute ends and the relative begins. That is where absolute reality, fathomed during our meditation, and relative existence begins. But it begins purely as a mistake. And worse than that in waking consciousness, if you can imagine anything worse than that, is that it's not that we have the knower in the process of knowing and that the known, and we have the known, and the known is not recognized as being the knower. In waking consciousness, we don't really even have the knower. And we are unaware of that which sees. The knower within is transcendental. And it is completely overwhelmed by it, overshadowed by the objects that we see. So the knower is actually gone in waking consciousness. If it were really gone, we wouldn't be awake. But in terms of our experience and our perception, it's gone. And we're left with the relative experience. And just as bad, even the process of knowing is very, very dim in waking consciousness. You're experiencing this, but you're not really experiencing the mechanics of the knowing of it. You're just engrossed in the drinking of it. So waking consciousness is what it is. Sometimes this is referred to as material life. Maharishi calls waking consciousness material life. Not just that you have a Cadillac and a yacht, but Your whole life is material. Without the material, there's nothing to rejoice. There's nothing left in life except the objects of perception. So the better objects of perception that you can afford, the better life is. Another way of saying that is in pure consciousness on the left here, you have really self-referral. Everything you're experiencing in the transcendent is really nothing other than oneself, different shades of oneself. But in waking consciousness, you can call that object referral life as opposed to self-referral life, or we call it material life, as we've said. Now, the great advantage to regular meditation, in addition to its remarkable effects upon health and eliminating even the most acute stress, as today's research shows, with soldiers with PTSD and on, heart disease, increasing longevity and lifespan, innumerable reasons our meditation is a priceless treasure. But the other reason is by continuing to fathom. And by fathom, I just mean slip into even a momentary glimpse of this state of extreme transcendent. It's the transcendent, but it's its most extreme state of absolute silence. That is, by the way, the most attractive aspect, and which draws us in deeply and causes us to kind of plunge into that state, even for a moment, until we get kicked out by the process of release of stress. There are unfulfilled desires rooted in the physiology that will tend to kick us out pretty quickly at first. But even a taste of it, a glimpse of it, is miraculously transformational. You come out just, wow, whatever that was, that darkness, that silence, that kind of absolute abstraction, and however brief it was, pow, do I feel refreshed. It's a total reboot, a reboot of the physiology, which has been left running on waking and sleeping and waking and sleep mode for weeks, perhaps. You have that experience. Fortunately, we have access to it twice a day. Is it really a complete refresh takes place? But that's not the end of the road. The end of the road is really the purpose of my talk today, primarily, that this, we say, fourth state of consciousness, pure consciousness, in all of its levels, that pure consciousness is sticky because it is so rewarding at every level of this, whether it's absolute silence or a more dynamic state of experiencing the silence of one's own self, observing itself. It's so enticing and so sticky, and the brain loves it. We love it. And the brain would love to hold that experience and tries to and continues to rewire itself to strengthen that experience and its clarity and its length. But at some point, that experience being so enticing and so sticky, the brain can emerge from the deep rest of meditation and still maintain that inner absolute silence, that absolute infinite silence remains as what? As a very, very abstract thing. Very, very abstract at first, where we come out of meditation and we have the outer world, much as it has been. Yes, we're fresher, we're more capable of handling things. We still have karmas, we still live in this weather, we still have whatever it is, it's our karma, but it's all on the surface of life, as it always has been. But now we recognize, but there's more than that. There's something quite, you could say, divorced from the surface of life, something that is intimate and so silent and so absolutely stable and so never changing. Whatever it is at first, it's an abstract thing. It's an abstract thing, but it's sticking with me as I drink the beverage or shave or whatever it is I'm doing, speaking. It sticks with you. And you have this remarkable situation in life called cosmic consciousness, which is first stage enlightenment. It's still capital E, enlightenment, but it is an early stage of it, so to speak. In this state of cosmic consciousness, where pure consciousness is with us 24/7, even engaged in activity, whatever the activity, at first it's like you smile because there's some stillness inside that is completely detached or divorced from the relative activity you're doing. And you wonder, what is this? It's very pleasant. What you notice also is that the relative activity is so much more fluid and so much more easy. And it just flows so effortlessly and naturally and without any bumps and jolts. And some of the bumps and jolts in life come from mistakenly thinking that when we are reaching for the beverage, it is I that am reaching for the beverage. And we insert our I-ness, our ego, our sense of self in everything we do. And that basically is just gumming up the works. That is not our self reaching for the beverage. That's our arm and our mind reaching for the beverage. But the self within is beyond any of that. And it's experienced as a state of one's absolute stability, giving one absolute confidence and absolute invincibility. Nothing can touch that. And that's a remarkable thing. So you experience the world flowing around you. My decision to do this, or I do this spontaneously, I do this by thinking and planning, and I do it. All that activity of spontaneous or planned activity in speech, it just flows by itself. And it's mysterious, frankly, because you don't know from where this action is flowing. You just see the relative mind and action as flowing, juxtaposed to that which is absolutely beyond any sense of space or time. And that's what this picture shows. It shows the normal realm of relative activity, relative experience on the surface, supported by this absolute at the very, very core depth of our being. So I would no longer call this state of cosmic consciousness material life, because even though our outer activities are totally material, dominated by material things and material thoughts and actions, but that's so small, ultimately, begins to be seen as something which is, concrete in a way, but non-substantial, and certainly non-significant in comparison to this inner grandeur that is growing and growing, in which you can increasingly feel that inner being is as big as the universe. That's where life is at that point. That's why someone in cosmic conscious says, I am that. Yes, you'll say, but I'm also this, but yeah, I'm really that. That has the reality. That has the substance. That is non-changing. That is real. All of this is so ephemeral that you can barely call it real. So that is cosmic consciousness. And let me just summarize what that means. From a neurophysiological perspective, I think Fred Travis, Maharishi himself, would say this is total brain functioning, global EEG coherence, the utilization of the entire brain stabilized, not just during transcendent, but in activity now. So you have this very strong orderliness of brain functioning during TM practice, but with regular practice over time, this coherent functioning of the brain where all the different areas of the mind are functioning in a highly and calculably. You can model this mathematically in an integrated and coherent way. In a newer meditator on the left, that strong coherence across the brain does not survive long after meditation. The longer-term meditator experiencing pure consciousness, it becomes a permanent feature of one's experience. So the literature of yoga, the Yoga Sutras say, this pure consciousness, inner unity, yoga, becomes a well-founded state, an established state, when it has been respectfully and regularly, uninterruptedly cultivated for a long time. So stabilizing pure consciousness is a great thing to tell your parents about, for all reasons, practical reasons, because it's the orderly brain functioning that correlates with IQ and creativity and success in life. It's the coherence of the brain that correlates and distinguishes world-class athletes from merely great athletes, or top-level managers from lower-level managers, and certainly distinguishes long-term meditators from new meditators. But more than just the brain, from an experiential standpoint, this pure consciousness and activity, cosmic consciousness, is also called self-realization, for the obvious reason that, still having the world of outer experience, which normally completely masks and overshadows the inner world of consciousness, which exists so we wouldn't be conscious, but which is itself unseen, unknown. In cosmic consciousness, the fifth state of consciousness, of course, the pure consciousness is now permanent. And this is also therefore called stabilization of inner bliss, 24 hours bliss, and it's called liberation because you're no longer overthrown by anything, nothing in the relative. And there will always be good hair days and bad hair days, although generally speaking, the whole trend is increasingly positive, but the relative is the relative. But liberation means no matter what goes on, the inner grandeur of being, the inner world, which is so vast, is always there. And in comparison to that, frankly, the relative world is a duty, it's a joy, it's a play, a field of enjoyment, a field of relative accomplishment, but in comparison to the infinity that is bigger than the universe, it barely makes an impression. From the Maitreya Upanishad, he, the enlightened, is in his own being, pure, never changing, never moving, unpollutable, and in peace beyond desires. He watches the drama of the universe as it unfolds around him. Or the Bhagavad Gita, even though fully engaged in action, mind and body, fully engaged, he, the seer, the knower, the self, does not act at all. And from the standpoint of overcoming suffering and sorrows, from this Buddhist text, established in the self, one overcomes sorrows and suffering. And I'll add this quote from the Yoga Vasishta. He, the enlightened, is awake, but enjoys the calmness of sleep. He is awake in sleep, etc. And we hadn't talked about that yet, but yes, it is true. If you look at the EEG of sleep, the brain waves during sleep, you have this very lazy but high amplitude delta waves, low frequency waves, just less than a few hertz, a few cycles per second. But during pure consciousness, which is second from the bottom here, you have this very steady, stable, coherent alpha wave activity across the brain. In enlightened sleep, you see pretty much the sum of this sleep activity, surface sleep activity, along with this pure consciousness activity, the high amplitude alpha activity, combined to give you a wave, which is the sum of the top and the second from the bottom, leading to the bottom. That's the electrophysiology of sleep. So this is what we see, that when pure consciousness is fully established, waking, dreaming, sleeping, in any experience, the self, the knower, is wide awake. They say when the light of consciousness turns on, it is inextinguishable. And I'm going to end with an experience of a friend of mine and many of ours here in this community, but their experiences mimicking this, paralleling this all across the community and all across the country and all around the world throughout history. They're just not that common, although they are certainly more common here. This is somebody who was T.M. Siddha, practiced the Siddhi program, and was doing program regularly in the dome, very, very regularly, I must say. He's one of the great dome goers. Wonderful person, down to earth. Normal in virtually pretty much every respect. Wouldn't necessarily stand out, except for everybody appreciated a kind of clarity and unflappability and sweetness and humor and lightness in him. He says, continuous, unbounded awareness dawned softly and unexpectedly as I exited the dome one morning in November of 2008. I had been meditating since 1973 and practicing the siddhis since 1998. It was clear that pure consciousness, pure being was with me as I exited the dome. That soft transcendence, that feeling of unboundedness I had become accustomed to in meditation all those years was now with me in activity. Everything was different, yet the same. This new element was with me as if dogging my footsteps. This new soft sweetness, this new purity, this new feeling of lightness, this new utter clarity. As with most of us, I had a career to manage during all these years and a family with children to support. But I made time for my TM twice a day, no matter what, even if it meant, as it often did, meditating on a bus, an airplane, or in pretty unlikely locations. Over the years, I waited expectantly and patiently for pure consciousness to stabilize, since transcending during meditation was quite regular and clear. And I often felt it must be just around the corner. As decades elapsed and I grew older, I started to abandon the notion that I would experience enlightenment in this life. I never stopped believing it was a reality, nor that my wonderful and deeply blissful meditation program could lead me there. I just stopped believing somehow that it was going to happen to me. So when cosmic consciousness tiptoed up to me that November day, just after I turned 64, I was astonished and elated. It seemed so delicate, fragile, almost shy. I didn't expect it to last. But as days and weeks went by, the experience not only endured, but it grew in strength. I finally came to accept, without any doubt, it was here to stay. With that, I began to relax into it and just let it be what it was, without any expectations or preconceived notions. I was as surprised as anyone that such a thing could happen to me, and here he recounts all of his shortcomings. He wasn't so studied in the spiritual literature like his friends, and so on. But given all his day-to-day responsibilities, I figured I was doing the best I could. Yet here it was, and it was undeniable. 2.5 years later, to my delight, the experience of 24-hour inner silent unboundedness has matured into something deep and grand. First, the burdens and vicissitudes, whatever that means, of life seem all but gone, or at least dramatically reduced. Moreover, they all seem so superficial. They do not touch my inner core, my inner being at all. Life has a lightness, delight, sweetness, and ease that is absolutely indescribable. My speech and my movements have gained a natural ease and grace. They just flow. From where they flow, I don't know. I don't see the mechanics. See, this is cosmic consciousness. They're flowing from himself. They're flowing from his being through his fine feeling and then intellect and mind. But in cosmic consciousness, you've got this gap between the inner light of being and the surface of experience, mental and sensory experience. What's in between, you don't know, but you're actually getting the benefit of, whether you know it or not, you're getting the full benefit of it, which is that your thoughts and actions are going to be graceful and natural and in the evolutionary flow of natural law. That means life supporting. So he says again, from where they flow, my actions, they just flow. I don't know. I don't see the mechanics. They just flow from nature. They seem attuned to the sweet evolutionary flow of nature, spontaneously timed for the most positive, uplifting effect. I live motivated for the benefit of others. There's really nothing I need do for myself. I feel no lack or need, completely secure and content inside. My inner essence is untouchable. It is free. I am free. Though my mind and emotions are active and engaged, I witness these actions from the serenity and sanctity of inner silence, in absolute freedom. Waking, dreaming, sleeping, these surface phenomena come and go. But these are distinct from me. I merely witness. My inner self is beyond change, unwaveringly content. And then he goes on to give great thanks to Maharshi, to Patanjali, to the Vedic tradition of masters who engineered and preserved these remarkable techniques. And the only thing he says at the end is he strongly implores everyone to follow the simple instructions Maharshi gave for the practice of TM, advanced techniques in the cities. Truly, that's all I ever did, he said, that resulted in this experience for me is as miraculous as anything I can think of. Yet it is utterly real, utterly simple, and utterly available to all. That I know for certain. So that concludes, I think. I've talked before about how this relates to a growing ability to achieve anything and everything, even just by the strength of thought and desire. I won't go through that again, but we know we have the ability to think at a deeper and more powerful level with meditation, and even think from the level of the absolute being in the TM City program. And that's the secret behind the ancient understanding that thoughts have power. So that is it. I will stop with cosmic consciousness. There is an evolution of cosmic consciousness into God consciousness or God realization, to unity consciousness, in which all the mysteries by then are completely exposed and unraveled, and just say that the true purpose of our practice is, yes, to prevent disease and promote health and longevity, to remove even the most acute stress, to develop our brains and creativity and academic and professional performance. But really, our meditation is for two reasons: fulfillment in higher states of human consciousness, and right now, and hopefully forevermore as well, creating peace and harmony in our global society, which you have all been doing, especially during these critical weeks. And I should probably say at this point, let's keep this going. We have gone through a major national election. The electoral process was surprisingly smooth, since well over 150 million people voted, which was unprecedented. But the election is over, and confusion remains, and strife and turbulence. And it is not time to abandon our contribution to greater wholeness, greater unity, greater smoothness. I'd really like to continue it. And I'm going to burden right now Carol and Bob Markowitz with the reality that there will be continuation, a wonderful reality, of talks in these coming few weeks. Let's take it maybe through Christmas holidays at this point, and we'll have Saturday and Sunday talks by many more brilliant speakers who we have not yet tapped, and continue this program as much as possible of a really active, dynamic, and robust participation in this incredible national super radiance and group meditation program. I thank you all, especially for that. It is critically needed, more than I think I have ever seen in my very long lifetime. Thank you. I'd love to have questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hagelin. That was an extraordinary journey from the depths of our own being to the expanse of the entire universe within and out. It's just amazing. We do have several questions that have come in, but before I get to them, I wanted to mention that for people who would like to learn more about this Creating Coherence program and practicing the TM and TM City program together at the same time, please go to tmevents.org and you can read about it, the times and how the program works, tmevents.org. If you would like to ask Dr. Hagelin a question now, please email your question into questions@tm.org or just put it into the Zoom chat box. We may as well just get started because the questions keep coming. So here's one question. Some of these questions, they go very deep. We could all understand that individual consciousness requires the brain to express that individuality. But when we talk about consciousness being all that there is, what is the brain? That is the physical structure that expresses this consciousness, that is all. Or does universal consciousness have no need for a brain?
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. And given the fact that it's 12:23 Midwest time, I probably won't take too many, because I'm going to receive more and more punishing looks from the audience here if we don't wrap up by maybe 12:30. So first of all, the universe doesn't need a physical brain. The unified field is there in the absence of absolutely anything else. It is self-sustaining. It is pure existence. It is beyond time altogether, so there's no worry about it ever changing. However, the unified field isn't nothing. It's, from the standpoint of our knowledge, it's consciousness. And consciousness by virtue has the capacity to know. and to start to distinguish and discriminate within itself and essentially conceptually build out of itself the infinite complex tapestry of mind and universe. It has that capability. Now, along the lines of that expression of the universe will emerge brains and hospitable planets which have their own capability of thought and computation and calculation and all the language and all the things that our brains can do. But really, the brain isn't creating consciousness any more than this is creating consciousness. They're both made out of consciousness. They're both fabricated out of the unified field. But there's still a big difference between the brain fabricated out of the unified field and this frosty cold beverage fabricated out of the unified field. The beverage has not much competence except to sit there. The brain is an incredibly subtle organ, incredibly sophisticated organ. Dr. Tony Nader talks about this in fabulous detail. It has the ability to take the tiniest impulses and construct the little sparks of consciousness that exist in every living cell. You can observe living cells under a microscope and you'll see that they're alive. They have some, you could say, very rudimentary form of consciousness. A brain cell the same, but even more so. But when you network a brain cell into this trillions of brain cells, and in this incredible network of our brain, or billions at least, with trillions of connections, you put together that in spark of consciousness or sparks into a spotlight of consciousness. The brain has that capability. It doesn't create consciousness, but it reflects it and it manipulates and lets it emerge as thought and language and action. That's really a remarkable, most remarkable machine in creation that we're aware of. So where does the spark come from? On the one hand, you could say it comes from the spark within every cell. Where does that spark come? It's just built into the nature of quantum mechanics and then built into the nature of unified field theory, ultimately. So everything, the consciousness is, unified field is all consciousness. But by the time it precipitates into manifest matter, sometimes the consciousness is hidden, obscure. It's like frozen consciousness. But sometimes it would manifest into a human brain, which has this remarkable ability to really interact with consciousness and amplify it and organize it. So that's the big difference between the brain. We could talk a little bit more someday about subtle mind or subtle physiology or subtle body to see if that may have a role to play. And that's kind of at the cutting edge of physics, you could say today, as we explore the nature of dark matter and in its properties, and to see whether that also may have something to do with our consciousness, as it seems to perhaps. So anyway, I mean, that's, I think, the universe doesn't need a brain to do what it does, but in the process of fulfilling its aspirations to create enlightened beings, you could say, which is kind of, I think, built into the plan, it does create brains like ours. And our brains are instrumental to our state of consciousness, obviously, if that helps.
Very good. Thank you. The next question is, do you have any information yet on how this series of the National Coherence Campaign has influenced the state of America during this election season, which was the goal of this effort, or how that could be possible?
Well, it is possible. We have done many experiments. In fact, many different collaborators and groups of scientists throughout the world now have done repeated experiments published in the most prestigious refereed journals in the areas of sociology, criminology, conflict. And it is a fact, it's an experimental fact that groups, and the larger the group, the better, coordinating their meditation or even sitting in one place like our golden domes and meditating as a group of 1,000 or 2,000 has a very marked, measurable, demonstrable impact on crime and social stress. So we have right now with this coordinated group, we can call it a virtual dome through our National Superradiance program. We have other siddhas all over the world, frankly, who are joining in their own national programs in support of America because of the very major nature of the election we've just had and hoping for the best and peace and unity. So we have a lot of help that way too. So can it have an effect with that many people? Yes, absolutely. Is it having effect? I think undeniably. Right now, I think the sides of this fence, you could say, that exist in our political world are some of them happy, some of them grieved, some of them, very content with the outcome of the election, as others, very much doubting and very unhappy with it. So there is a natural polarization, but despite that, so far, all is proceeding somewhat coherently. Certainly everything that's happening that needs to happen is in the realm of relative normalcy. And that, there haven't been mass outbreaks and there haven't been anything like that, which are very rare in history, but possible, certainly, in a situation like today, with a nation more polarized politically than I've ever seen it, perhaps than has ever been. So I think we've helped keep the lid on. I don't think this epic is entirely over until the outcome of the election is decided. People have some time to get used to it and make the best of it, whatever side they're on. That happens every election. But in this time, in this atmosphere, that is less certain than it has ever been. We've never seen anything quite like this in terms of the uncertainty of a result, which, according purely to the election, one might think has been decided. So yes, we really need to keep up our unity as a family, knowing that within our family, there are all different types of political views, all different types of all views, and all different types of persons and so forth. So that's fine. That's the nature of unity and diversity. We need to stay unified with our family, with our friends, no matter what surface differences there might be of opinion about this or that. We need to recognize that we're all Americans and we're all human beings. We are all fundamentally one person, you could say, because we're at the deepest level, we are all one consciousness. There is only one self. And the appearance of difference is a bit of a mirage. Yes, differences exist on the surface, so it's not a total mirage to see differences. But to see those differences as antithetical or enmity or enemy, that is a total mirage. And we have to keep that kind of mirage from bubbling up within ourselves or within our society. And for that purpose, our group program is really the one thing that in technology called yagya, which is another technology from the Vedic wisdom, which we are engaging as much as possible. These national yagyas for the US are very, very important. And we're just sending out, I think the last couple of days, another such appeal for another monthly national yagya. That's the other thing we can do. There are many things we need to do for our work and for our families, but for our world currently, for our country currently, the most important thing we can do, besides staying safe, is to take long, deep program and coordinated program when possible. And if you can, contribute to the national yagya to make it large and powerful. That's really what we can do. And apart from inviting you all to continue with this program, and tune in again next week, and there'll be an announcement once we figure out what next week will bring by way of talks, to just stay with us, stay settled on the self. Don't get drawn off yourself. Always act from that state, that position of being settled in one's own expanded self, and you can do no wrong. Thank you very, very much for joining me here today, and also, of course, for participating in this very important national program.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hagelin. This is absolutely enlightening. I have a few announcements I have to make for everyone. 3 extraordinary events that are coming up. One is this afternoon at 4 p.m. Central Time. We have an interview with Chandrika Tandon. Chandrika is considered one of the top global business leaders in the world. She's a noted humanitarian and philanthropist, as well as a Grammy-nominated musician. Her foundation is dedicated to serving humanity by playing leadership roles in education and the arts. She's currently the vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of New York University, the chair of the board of NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, and more. That's at 4 p.m. Central Time. To get the Zoom link for this talk, please go to tmevents.org. And that is today at 4 o'clock Central Time. Go to TM Events. The second very important and very exciting event takes place on Wednesday, November 25th at 12 noon Central Time. Dr. Tony Nader, MD, PhD, will be offering a Facebook live stream event entitled 5 Tips for Your Mental Survival. Dr. Nader is an author, medical doctor, and neuroscientist trained at MIT and Harvard, as well as a globally recognized scholar in the fields of meditation, yoga, and consciousness. As Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's successor, Dr. Nader is the head of the International Transcendental Meditation Organizations and oversees consciousness-based educational programs in the field of health, business, education in more than 100 countries. So to find out information on the Zoom link there, it's actually a Facebook Live event. You can go to Facebook, type in Dr. Tony Nader, and then go to the video section and you can watch that live, or you can also get the information again at tmevents.org. The last exciting event that I wanted to announce is on December 3rd, the David Lynch Foundation and the nationwide Transcendental Meditation Organization will be hosting Meditate America for a Healthy Nation. This is a free online benefit concert bringing transcendental meditation to healthcare workers, veterans, and families under trauma and stress. The concert celebration will be co-hosted by the award-winning actor Hugh Jackman and his wife, Deborah Lee Furness, as well as ABC's Good Morning America co-anchors Robin Roberts and George Stephanopoulos, as well as ABC's medical correspondent, Jennifer Ashton, MD. The concert will feature special performances by Sting, Graham Nash, Elvis Costello, Keisha, Angelique Kidjo, Jim James, and the Brooklyn Youth Choir. All of these artists are coming together to raise awareness and funds so that people in need, including healthcare workers, first responders, veterans, and the families in under-resourced neighborhoods can all learn to meditate. Again, Dr. Hagelin, thank you for this brilliant, enlightening, mind-expanding, if I can use that term, talk. It'll be archived with all of the other talks. Just go to miutalks.org. It'll be archived there in 3 to 4 days. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll be soon announcing all of the upcoming speakers. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.